Hi again. It's Thursday afternoon on October 23rd. And today I'd like to talk about what's going on in Ukraine from voices that you've probably not heard about. So I had initially planned to just present the results of a conversation with a friend that I have who's now living in Ukraine. But I thought after that I would want to include some other sources, so some issues that are happening now that you probably haven't heard about. I'm also going to talk about the historical legacy of World War II and how many people of those living in Ukraine actually fought with the Soviet Union compared with how many fought for the Bandera faction, whose descendants took over in the 2014 coup and who control Ukraine now. Also, I'll mention a couple of notable Ukrainians who left in 2014 and took refuge in Russia. And I'll talk about how many Ukrainians feel about the war, how many voted for the peace candidate Zelensky. What do they feel about the mobilization? In other words, because the Ukrainian army has lost many soldiers, the government has been forced to, I could say forced, I don't know if that's the right word or not, but the government has resorted to mobilization, which is in many cases forced. And also the attitude of those controlling the political discourse in Kiev towards Russian-speaking people living in Ukraine. And I've got some links below. Some of these are some articles that I found online, and also some posts that were on Telegram. This is from it's a Russian channel. It's a Russian-speaking channel that's based in Dnipropetrovsk, which is in the eastern half of Ukraine, which is predominantly Russian-speaking, and in fact, the Russian military is making inroads into that area now. So first, the points of my conversation with my friend living in Ukraine. First of all, this is a woman that I met here in Chiang Mai. We both have been involved in e-commerce, selling stuff online for a number of years. And I met her at one of these meetups that you have with people who do this kind of thing. And because she's from Ukraine, and because I have this thing about, I just really like to talk with people from foreign countries, because I'm really interested in hearing what other people have to say, not just people in my as an American, I get exposed to what Americans think all the time, but to actually hear what people have to say who live in other countries, and especially countries that are there's controversy. It's like good to. I've always had this idea, even when I was a kid. How do you need to hear both sides in order to find out what's actually going on? So I met her, and her story is that she had grown up in Soviet Ukraine. That is, when it was the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. It was part of the Soviet Union, of course, and when the Soviet Union fell apart, the economy in Ukraine fell apart as well, and so she ended up going to Canada, where she carried on her life there. She learned to speak English pretty well, and but she said that when she got there, she found there were a lot of Nazis. So many of you may be surprised to hear that, but there was actually, the most notorious example of this was the Canadian Parliament met, and this guy is there who's 98 years old, and the Speaker of the Canadian Parliament stands up with a big smile on his face, and he says, "We'd like to honor, I think his name is Yaroslav Hunka, who was fighting the Russians during World War II." Well, what he forgot was that Canada was fighting with Russia to stop the Nazis. And this guy was a Nazi. He's a part of a Nazi battalion that had engaged in war crimes against people who, they were opposing the invasion of the Germans. He was on the side of the Germans. And yet here he is, the Canadian Parliament is applauding him, giving him a standing ovation. So you wonder what the heck is going on in Canada. So anyway, she was pretty, miffed, kind of wondering what the hell is going on here. And she told me a story one time how she was working there, and she would send money back to her mother, who was living back in Ukraine. And the guy who ran this, it was a money transfer service. So when you have money and trying to transfer it from one country to another, you'd use a transfer service of some sort. They have them even now of various kinds. You can get them online. But in this case, you actually went to a physical office to get this done. Kind of like maybe like Western Union or something. I think they still have that. So she went to this office, and she discovered that this guy is, one of these nationalists. And he says, "Why are you speaking Russian? You're Ukrainian." And she says, "Well," and then she's told me, as the story goes, she addresses him in pure Ukrainian language because she can speak Ukrainian. She said, "Well, Russia is my native language, and Russia is the language that most people speak, especially when you're doing business, so that's why I'm doing it." And he was kind of like, like that. But, what could he say? Because he was speaking Russian too. But, they have this kind of visceral hatred towards everything Russian by some of these Ukrainian nationalists. It's really strange. Anyway, so there she was, and then she was living there for several years, and then she decided to come back to Ukraine. And what she discovered was that when she got back to Ukraine, the Ukrainian government was run by Nazis. And so there she is. She's living in her hometown where she grew up, or near her hometown, taking care of her mother, and because her mother is elderly and needs medical care and stuff like that. So, and she wants to be with her mother. So she was. So I was asking her, tell me what's the mood there? And she says, first of all, she says, you cannot talk with anybody because you don't know who's listening. And if you speak out and you say something that is contrary to the official government line, you can get into serious trouble. So that's one major factor that I think people need to be aware of, that Ukraine is the many politicians who opposed that the coup government that the United States installed in 2014 have either had to flee the country, I'll talk about that in a second, or have been outright assassinated or sent to prison. We don't know where many of them are. So it is quite dangerous to speak out if you're in Ukraine. So the next thing is she talked about was the fact that she's living in this city, and there's a lot of bombing going on. A lot of missile strikes and drones and things like that, because there's a war going on, and Russia basically said, we cannot tolerate a Nazi. We lost millions of people in World War II due to Nazis and their collaborators, their Ukrainian collaborators. We're not going to tolerate that any more than the United States would tolerate a hostile country on the United States' border. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Russians put missiles in Cuba because the United States had put missiles in Turkey. And the United States thought it was fine to put missiles in Turkey, but they didn't want any missiles in Cuba, and they were willing to fight a war about it. And so that's the reason for this war in Ukraine, is because the U.S. government went in there in a coup, overthrew the democratically elected government, and proceeded to persecute people who speak Russian. So that is, that was the reality of it. So, but Russia is, they do not have this kind of visceral hatred towards Ukraine. They consider them to be brotherly people, and I'll explain a little bit more about that. Because during World War II, I should just, antithetically say that during World War II, my sense had always been that the vast majority of the Ukrainian population was on the side of the Soviet Union. And in fact, I just checked this out, and it said that something like 7 million Ukrainian soldiers fought on the side of the Soviet Union, whereas only 250,000 fought on the side of the Nazis and the fascists in World War II. So this is it's a minority part of the population. Because of that, Russia just does not, when they drove the Germans out of the Soviet Union, they did not engage in the kind of terror bombing that the United States and Britain did. So, for example, the city of Dresden in Germany was leveled to the ground in firebombing, and the Russians didn't do that. That's not their style of waging war. But so she said that the Russians are targeting military infrastructure and facilities rather than civilian, and it was scary because you hear these bombs going off, but her neighborhood wasn't affected, and but she pointed out that there was a quote unquote furniture factory or furniture warehouse that was blown up by a missile strike, and it was a big explosion that took place there. And what that indicates is that furniture does not explode. If you drop a bomb on something and it's just furniture or whatever it is, it's not going to blow up. But if it's ammunition with explosives, or it's got fuel, or massive amounts of gasoline or diesel fuel or explosives, and you drop a bomb on it, it's going to explode. So she said that's the kind of stuff that's going on, and that's how Russia's waging this war. Whereas the Ukrainians are, yes, they are starting to bomb refineries, but for years earlier, before the Russian intervention in 2022, the Ukraine military was shelling civilian areas. That was the reason why for the whole problem in the first place, is that when the coup government took over, it was opposed. They were seriously Russophobic, and they were targeting people. One of the first laws they passed was to outlaw Russia as a legitimate language, even though many, if not a majority of the people in Ukraine speak Russian. I'll talk about that a little bit later. So the issue. So that's one issue. The fact that Russia targets military installations, not civilians. And in fact, I think even the Ukrainians have admitted that the number of casualties among the civilian population is quite low, whereas the military casualties are very, very high. Now, Ukraine. The thing about Ukraine is that it was patched together. It was over the course of several centuries. There was the Kievan Rus, which was Kiev was the capital of a Russian, ethnic Russian area, and eventually it became integrated with Moscow, which became the predominant city. But Kiev was always a big Russian city. My grandmother used to say, and I've subsequently checked with other Russian people, there's an expression, you can ask your way to Kiev. It's like all roads lead to Rome. So Kiev has always been a significant component of the Russian ethnic and cultural space. Let's put it that way. But you see, the western part of Ukraine was more rural, and the people were not as educated, and they spoke a kind of a mixture of Russian, Polish, and other dialects, so that it didn't have the kind of literary quality that Russia historically has had. But in addition to the Ukrainian-speaking areas, there were Hungarian-speaking areas that were attached after World War II, and also there were Slovakian areas, and there were also Romanian-speaking areas. So Ukraine is a kind of amalgam of these different areas, which can be okay. Canada has a population that is primarily English-speaking, but you have Quebec, which is French-speaking. And there was a referendum. Some people may disagree with it, but basically they decided that French Canadian was a legitimate language in Canada, and that they basically get along. They've got it's French and English-speaking country, so that's possible. And of course, even in the United States, you have you go to Los Angeles. There's Korean-speaking people. There's Spanish-speaking people. People from many different Chinese. Many different people speaking different languages, and somehow they managed to hold it together, at least for the time being. It's hard to say how things are going to go going forward. But you see, what happened was when this new government came in, this coup government came in, they basically said we are an ethnic state. Ukraine is the only legitimate ethnic group in Ukraine, and nobody else has any legitimacy. So Hungarians were persecuted and treated as second-class citizens. Same with Romanians and Slovakians, and certainly the Russians got the brunt of it. Okay, so now the next issue was that Zelensky, after this the coup happened, the civil war broke out because Russian-speaking areas in the Donbass, that's in the Donetsk region and the Lugansk region, rebelled against these people who were dropping bombs on them. I mean, what would you do if the government's dropping bombs on you? You're gonna say, oh, please be nice. No, they're not gonna be nice. You have to. They were resisting. So this was a smoldering war going on. It was a hot war for into 2015, and then there were the Minsk agreements, which were mediated, you could say, between the Kiev regime and the people in Donbass. And the agreement was that the Ukrainian government was going to negotiate with the people in Donbass, and Donbass would get limited autonomy so they would remain part of Ukraine, but they would have rights to speak Russian, to maintain Russian culture, Russian traditions, the Russian Orthodox Church, and so on. And the Ukrainian government, they resisted that from 2014, 2015, and finally in 2022 it reached the boiling point where the amount of shelling that was going on had increased, from 40 a day to up to 1,400 a day. And that was the reason why Russia finally intervened. So, but you see, in 2019, there was an election, and Poroshenko, who was the president of Ukraine at that time, was extremely unpopular. And Zelensky was this guy who was a TV comedian. He had a TV show. And he created this TV show called Servant of the People, which is about this school teacher who somehow ended up as president of Ukraine. And he starts, cleaning house and cleaning up the corruption, which is endemic. Everybody knows it's endemic. And he campaigned on the basis of peace. And he won by 75%. And then as soon as he became president, he went to the front line of the dividing line between the Donbass area and the Ukrainian government-controlled area, and he said to these rabid nationalists, guys, let's cool it, let's have a peace treaty. And they said, no way, we'll string you up from a lamppost before we're gonna declare peace, have peace with these Colorado. They call them Colorado beetles. They do dehumanize Russians as to consider them to be insects. So, and he basically had to give in both to their threats as well as he was getting a massive, he was bribed and threatened to maintain what is his current posture as extremely hostile to any kind of peace deal that favors Russian rights for the Russian-speaking population. So there was these broken promises that are very important, and that has been a major factor going forward up to now. Now, the other point that she wanted to make is that, she grew up during the Soviet time, and many people, and I've met many people, both I met her friend, another friend of hers who's also from Ukraine, They had very fond memories of the Soviet Union. They said life was good. It wasn't, nobody was rich, but people had, they had a decent life. And one of the things that she told me was that if you lived in the Soviet Union, there was a housing shortage, and the policy of the government was that we don't want homeless people, so they built massive amounts of housing. And first under Stalin, they built a lot of housing because they were industrializing, and the people coming in from farms and agrarian occupations, they needed them to work in factories, and they needed a place for them to live. So they were building all these Stalin area apartment buildings. And then when Khrushchev became the premier of the Soviet Union, it was the same kind of situation. So he built these apartments, which are called Khrushchevkas. So his name was Nikita Khrushchev, and he was responsible for having this massive building program called Khrushchevkas. And what's funny is that these were all standardized apartments. So there's a Soviet era movie about this guy who, it's New Year's Eve, and he gets drunk, and somehow he ends up on a train, and he ends up on a train going from Moscow to Leningrad. It's now St. Petersburg. It was Leningrad at the time. And he's got his key, and he's wandering along the street. Here's the street. Yeah, okay, there's my apartment building. Oh, that's my apartment. Here's the key. He opens the door, and it works. But it's the same key of his actual apartment in Moscow. It was so standardized. So, but they made a comedy out of it, which is understandable, But the thing is that after when Ukraine became independent, and by the way, when he built these, when Khrushchev had these apartments built, you got a free apartment. There were families living together. It's like, you've got an apartment, you've got more than one family living together, and this is not unusual. I mean, here in the United States, you've got people, from different countries. They're immigrants coming in. They don't have any money, so they're all living in the same apartment. It was kind of like that during the Soviet times, but people wanted their own place. So the government basically, so you'd be renting a place, and rents were no more than like 10% of your income. So just for all of you renters out there, what are you paying as a percentage of your income? What is your rent? And the thing is that you were on a list, and after 10 or 15 years of waiting, you would get your own apartment. So, and they were free, and it was so free that you could pass it along to your children, free, no estate taxes, just you got it from the government free, you're passing it on to your children free. Now, just compare that to the system of housing in the United States, where, I had this friend of mine who bought an apartment in New York somewhere. I don't know where it was, but he's now a billionaire because he bought this rundown place in some area of New York, and it was in the wrong neighborhood, but it turned into the right neighborhood over time because basically it got gentrified. So he's got this crummy old apartment building, and he says, and the people are all lower class, working class people, and he raises the rate 10% a year, and that's how it is. And he's friends with the judge, and he gives his judge a nice bottle of brandy for Christmas every year. And strangely enough, the judge rules in his favor. So that's how it works if you're a renter in the United States. If you're lucky to have a regular landlord, and if you're not lucky, then you've got BlackRock who owns your house. And of course, if you do buy a house, you have to put down a certain amount of money, and then do you own the house, or who owns the house? Okay, if you put down, let's say 10 or 20%, you own 10 or 20% of that house. The bank owns 80 or 90% of the house, and over time, the way loans are structured in the United States, it so much favors the banks because the the interest on the loan increases, and what's the word, compound interest. So so the interest is going into is adding to the loan, and then you're paying interest on the interest unless you pay a certain amount of your mortgage every month, and hopefully you're paying more off than the loan amount, so that gradually you pay it down. So most people, they have a 30-year mortgage, and they pay roughly 4 times the actual cost of the house, because the bank, with all the interest that they charge, that's how it works in the United States. In Russia or in the Soviet Union, you had to wait 10 or 15 years. You were living in a cramped apartment with a bunch of other people, but after 10 or 15 years, you got your own house for free. Now, what's really interesting about this is that when I was in Russia recently, I met up with a friend of mine who's an American living in Russia. He just married a Russian woman, and a really nice lady. She's a singer, and she's got an amazing voice. And so they are renting a Khrushchevka. So you still have the legacy of the Soviet Union. Now, the other part of this legacy is that the infrastructure in Ukraine is all communist era infrastructure. The dams, the nuclear power plants, the electrical infrastructure, all of that was built by the Soviet Union. And most of it has not been maintained well at all. I visited Crimea in 2015, and I could see the place was really run down. They hadn't put any effort into keeping it up. So, but she told me the story about this. My friend told me the story about this. She was listening to it like a call-in show, and some Ukrainian guy was complaining about the dam. The Soviet Union, they're so terrible, and the communists are so bad. And so she says to the other caller, they're talking on this kind of a debate, and the other caller says, so you're happy that you like Russia then? You hate the communists so much that now the Russians, because of this war, are bombing all of that communist infrastructure, so they're decommunizing the country for you. Isn't that nice of them? You hate communism so much that you'll take the benefits of it, and then you complain when somebody comes in because you're so hostile to that country that actually built your country, built your houses, built your infrastructure, built your electrical plants and so on, and you hate them anyway. What's that about? What is the psychological mindset of these people that has this kind of visceral hatred? My friend said that life was good. George Lucas, the filmmaker, maker of Star Wars, said, hold on your hats here. He said that Soviet filmmakers had more latitude to make movies than American filmmakers have. Why? Because the American filmmakers are all bound by profit. And in the Soviet era, they weren't bound by profit. They could make films that weren't based, they weren't based on the idea of making profit. They said, yeah, they didn't want people, criticizing the government. But hey, your country's been under attack since with the Cold War. All the Western countries have been hostile to Russia for 100 years. So they're sensitive to it, and even in the United States, is freedom of speech, any better? I just got kicked out of Facebook, Well, they didn't send me to prison. No, I did have a friend who was in Facebook prison, for 30 days for saying stuff that Facebook didn't like. But in my case, they just said, get out of here. So, what can you say? But at least at this point, they're not hauling me off to the Gulag or hauling me off to Leavenworth or one of the other for-profit prisons in the United States. But I digress. Okay, now the next topic is that there are this fellow named Larry Johnson, who's a former CIA operative, and he left the CIA, and he's been a real vocal critic of U.S. foreign policy. And even though he comes from a military and intelligence background, I come from a completely the opposite background. But the objective fact, he and I see eye to eye on the objective fact of what the problems are regarding the U.S. military and foreign policy. So he went to Russia recently, and he met a number of people, and one of whom was, I've got a link here in which he talks about several people that he met in Moscow, one of whom was the former prime minister of Ukraine, who fled to Russia in the lead up to the February 2014 sponsored coup. So when this fellow obviously could see what was going on, and he left in January of 2014, basically a month before the coup happened, because he was, understandably fearful of his life. And of course, the president of Ukraine at the time was Yanukovych, and he had signed an agreement with the demonstrators, the violent demonstrators in Kiev in February 2014. And they broke the agreement, and they took over the parliament, and they staged the coup. And they were out looking for him. They wanted to kill him, and he escaped to Russia. So so you're seeing that there's a lot of refugees that have actually gone to Russia. So that's one other aspect I wanted to cover. Now the next issue I wanted to take was that what is the state of the Ukraine military? What I hear is that the Russian government there is some opposition to the war within Russia. There are people who we call traditional liberals who've always had very rose-colored view of what the United States is, and they think America's great and so on, and they like the music and rock and roll and all these kinds of things, and they like American culture. That's understandable, but they don't. They oppose the Russian government. So there are a number of people who have left Russia. I've met you meet a lot of Russians here in Thailand, where I live, who are opposed to the government, and I've had some conversations with them, and I feel, and they don't, we don't see eye to eye, let's put it that way. And also inside of Russia, I've met people who also oppose the special military operation. But the reality is that Russia is signing up 30,000 volunteers a month, and that's how they've been able to build up their military to be such a formidable force, because they are what they're doing is they're paying people to become soldiers for the government. And when you're in Moscow, as I was earlier this year, you can see billboards where it's they're patriotic billboards, sign up for the military, and there are a lot of people signing up. But in Ukraine, when the special military operation happened, there was some patriotic upsurge in Ukraine, and a lot of people did sign up. But gradually over time, they've started to realize that the people running the country really do not have their interests at heart, and B, the danger of dying or getting seriously injured is extremely high. So as a result, not only that, but they're not getting any rest and recreation. So in Russia, they've got enough people so that you go into a position, you fight a battle for a week or so, and then you're out for a month to recover, something like that. You have relatively short periods of time when you're on the line, your life is on the line, it's dangerous, it's tough, but you also get some respite. In Ukraine, they're not getting that respite. So this data says that Ukraine has suffered, this is from Eurasian Times, over 200,000 Ukrainian soldiers have deserted, with their numbers increasing drastically. The data cited above clearly indicate that the Ukrainian army is experiencing significantly higher desertion rates than the Russian army. Ukraine suffered 250,000 desertions since the war began with Russia, as per reports. Russia witnessed only 20,538 desertions during the same period of time. So in other words, Ukraine, with a population maybe 1/4 of what Russia's is, even less now, is suffering 10 times the desertions. So it says, without doubt, both of these figures could be a serious underestimation, as both countries have a history of hiding and minimizing battlefield losses. Well, it's pretty clear that based on even independent assessments of Russian battlefield losses, that they're considerably less. This is like a British website that tracks this. Their battlefield losses are significantly less, like 1/10 or 1/20th the number of losses that the Ukrainian military is experiencing. Let's see, what else do we have here? So it says it's pretty evident that Kiev is witnessing many more desertions, 12 times more than the Russian army, even though Ukraine is, quote unquote, defending its homeland. So let's talk about that part. I've got some links here, and one of them is from a Ukrainian legislator. Now, these links are from Telegram, which is it's a messaging service that is available. I think you can get it pretty much anywhere in the world. I'm not sure how that works in the United States, but it's available, generally speaking. And so there's one item with a Ukrainian legislator who resents the fact that 90% of people living in Kiev speak Russian, not Ukrainian. So and this is a quote from this post. It's her speaking Russian, so you can click on the link and you can see it. It's in Russian, but you can translate. Telegram has this automatic translation function where the blurb beneath a video you can translate it into English. So it says, and again, widely spoken, Sofia Fedina, a deputy of the Verkhovna Rada, representing the party European Solidarity of the ex-president Poroshenko, expressed her indignation about the language issue. She is outraged that the overwhelming majority of Kiev residents speak Russian. According to Fedina, almost every passerby on the streets of the Ukrainian capital speaks Russian. She claims that about 90% of the people she happened to talk to on the streets of Kiev prefer Russian. And the post goes on, accept it and live peacefully, Fedina. Maybe this just isn't your city. So you see, we're getting to the heart of this problem that Ukraine has, that you have this fanatical Russophobic faction that got control of the government and hates everything government. They take down poets' monuments, poets. It's irrational. So and they've outlawed Russian. Like if you go into a restaurant in Ukraine, technically speaking, if you order in order in the Russian language, the waiter or waitress will say, "Oh, you're not allowed to speak Russian. I won't accept your order unless you speak Ukrainian." And a lot of Russians don't speak Ukrainian, so they're out to lunch. What are you supposed to do? So this is the fundamental cause of the civil war that has been going on, backed by fomented by the United States. Okay, now the other aspect here is that there's this forced mobilization. So you've got a lot of people who are being forcibly mobilized. It's like dragooned off the street. And so you can go onto Telegram and you can see examples of this. So there's one example that I saw where there are Ukrainians in a passing car interrupted a forced mobilization. This is an area in the Dnipropetrovsk region. And it says, seeing another crime by the TCC, these are the forcible mobilizers, some men jumped up and prevented the guy from being twisted up. And their comment is, "Our applause to real men." So you can see there's this guy on the ground surrounded by these police ready to take him away. And then these guys get out of the car and they chase them off. So he says such forceful acts of disobedience, that is, they're disobeying the mobilizers, are happening more and more often every day in various regions of Ukraine. And so he says, so disrespectful police officers, remember, no matter how long the rope twists, the end is in the same, a noose for you. So there's that. And then there's another one where it shows Ukrainians are on the street and are resisting forced mobilization and the regime itself. And, the question arises, is a rebellion against the coup regime possible? So the comment here is that how the conflict in Dnipro, that's the modern, post-coup version of Dnipropetrovsk. They just shorten it to Dnipro. I guess they think people aren't smart enough to be able to speak Russian, so they just shorten it. So it says one of these police officers deliberately started taking the phone from a girl, which distracted attention, and at that moment the rats began to kidnap this guy. Hatred and towards the TCK, that is the mobilizers, and the police grows every hour. Even all the repressions launched by the government against the people who resist the lawlessness of these mobilizers cannot intimidate the people. The war brings death, destruction, and suffering to the Ukrainian people, but Yermak, that is the regime of Zelensky and his lieutenant Yermak, needs it to survive. Through fear, repression, and killing, the green scum try to hold the people back. But at some point, all this hatred towards the junta may burst out, and then all the enforcers of power and its servants will be in trouble. Ukrainians today have nothing left to lose except for their chains. And so that's an example of this, the fact that there is serious resistance to the war between Russia and Ukraine among Ukrainians. Lindsey Graham is the senator from South Carolina, and in 2014 he was there in Kiev, blatantly meddling in the political affairs of Ukraine. And later on he was caught saying, every dollar spent is killing Russians. That's a great thing. And another comment he made was that Ukraine has trillions of dollars in minerals, and we want to get them for ourselves. We don't want Russia to get them. And of course, BlackRock and these other, investment, what can I call them, vulture capitalists, basically, have their eyes on these Ukrainian resources. So the people have realized that they're not fighting for freedom; they're fighting for BlackRock, and they're being used as cannon fodder. Their chances of surviving on the front line is extremely low because the government doesn't support them. They don't give them enough food and ammunition. They're grossly outclassed by the Russian military-industrial complex, and so they're rebelling. And it's just a question of when this whole terrible catastrophe that has happened to Ukraine is going to end. So that's basically it. There's a final link here from Military Watch magazine. It says the Ukrainian army desertion rates surge amid catastrophic personnel losses. Most conscripts just trying to escape. So if you're captured by one of these forcible mobilizations, they take you to this training camp for who knows how long, maybe a week, 2 weeks, whatever it is. And many of these people find a way to escape. So that's the situation in Ukraine. And this is not something that you're going to hear probably on the major media. But what I try to do is I go directly to people who are actually living there or from sources inside Ukraine to point out that the narrative that we've been told about Ukraine is completely the opposite of the truth. And just as it was the case with Afghanistan Vietnam and all the other countries that the United States has gone into with the intention of stealing its resources. The people have no agency. They're slaughtered if necessary to get rid of them, so that our Wall Street bankers can get control of their resources for free, quote unquote. And country after country has been destroyed, and Ukraine is the latest. So that's the fundamental issue here. And as I say, I wanted people to hear what Ukrainians have to say about this, not what the government tells you Ukrainian thinks about it. So I'll just close there. Of course, if you'd like to support my channel, that would be wonderful. You can either, like it or share it or comment or make a donation. You can subscribe. You can buy one of my information billboard T-shirts, I call them, because they're not promoting me personally. They're just promoting ideas like be kind or question everything, or maybe you find enlightenment, things like that. So those are my personal values, and I want peace. I want people's consciousness to rise so that we understand the nature of our situation, because once you have awareness, then you can actually change things. So again, thanks again for listening, and I'll catch you next time.